The story of economics back in the early 1800s isn't really about dusty old theories and numbers. At its heart, it's the story of an incredible friendship, and even bigger disagreements, between two men who had literally set the stage for the entire field, Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo.
So let's meet our two main characters, because you couldn't find a more classic odd couple. First, you've got Thomas Malthus. He is the ultimate insider. We're talking son of a well-connected lawyer, Cambridge-educated, a professor, and a minister in the Church of England. Then you have David Ricardo, the total outsider. He was the son of Jewish immigrants, had zero formal schooling after he turned 14, and get this, he was disowned by his own family for marrying outside his faith. So what does he do? He goes into business for himself and becomes a ridiculously successful stock market millionaire.
So you'd look at these two guys on paper and think, no way! These two would have absolutely nothing in common. And you'd be right, except for the fact that they somehow became the closest of friends.
They met for the first time in 1811. The plan was to have a nice, amicable discussion in private to sort out their different views. Well, that one little discussion ended up lasting for 12 years, right up until the day Ricardo died. Their families were super close, hanging out almost every single weekend. These two were obsessed with each other's ideas. They were constantly thinking and talking about what the other one was writing. And their friendship held strong, even though they disagreed on pretty much every major economic issue of their day.
All right, so to really get into their legendary arguments, we have to understand where each of them was coming from. Let's kick things off with Malthus, the guy who gave economics its, let's say, unfortunate nickname, the Dismal Science. So at the time, there were all these utopian philosophers going around saying society could become perfect, that we could get rid of war and poverty altogether. Malthus, being a bit of a pessimist, heard this and decided to just demolish that entire idea with what he considered cold, hard logic, which he laid out in his essay on the principle of population.
He starts with something really simple, food. Our ability to grow more food, he said, increases one step at a time. It's a straight line. Think, 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. It's an arithmetic progression. You just add a bit more each year.
And this is the crucial part. Human population doesn't just add, it multiplies. When you don't check it, it grows geometrically. So 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8. Malthus figured the population could double every 25 years, and you don't have to be a math genius to see where this is going, right?
This is the fundamental problem. The explosive, geometric growth of people is on a collision course with the slow, arithmetic growth of food. And the result isn't some happy utopia. It's a terrifying, brutal correction from nature. As he put it, a giant, inevitable famine would eventually show up to level the population with the food of the world. Pretty grim stuff.
So according to Malthus, humanity's backed into a corner with only 3 ways out. The first check on population is just plain misery, stuff like famine, plague, and war that just kills a lot of people. The second is what he called vice, which for him included things like prostitution and even birth control, which he thought was immoral. That leaves only one positive option, moral restraint. People choosing to marry later in life and have smaller families. And, being a skeptical minister, he wasn't exactly betting on humanity to make the right choice.
Okay, so now let's switch gears and talk about his best friend and biggest rival, David Ricardo. He saw the economy not as some big human drama, but more like a complex, intricate machine.
While Malthus is painting this huge, sweeping picture of humanity's destiny, Ricardo is down in the weeds. He's not a preacher, he's more like a mechanic. He was a super meticulous, systematic thinker who wanted to take the whole economic system apart, piece by piece, to figure out exactly how it worked. Specifically, he wanted to know, where does all the money go?
He basically breaks society's economic pie into 3 big slices. First, you've got the workers. They earn wages. But Ricardo predicted their wages would always get pushed right down to the bare minimum needed to survive. Second, you have the capitalists, the factory owners, the entrepreneurs. They earn profits. But he thought competition would be so intense that eventually all those profits would just get competed away down to almost nothing. So who's left? The landlords. In his model, as the population grows, people have to start farming on worse and worse land. This makes the good land that landlords own more and more valuable. So in the end, they're the only ones who just keep getting richer and richer.
Okay, so we've got our 2 fighters in the ring. On one side, Malthus, the big picture preachers worried about doomsday. On the other, Ricardo, the meticulous analyst, obsessed with the machine of distribution. Now, let's see what happened when their big ideas crashed into each other over the hottest issues of their time. Their first big fight was over something they called gluts. Well, we just call it recession. Ricardo was a huge believer in an idea called Say's law. The basic gist is that supply creates its own demand. In other words, the act of making stuff creates the money needed to buy that same stuff. The system just naturally balances itself out. But Malthus was looking at this and thinking, hang on a second. He was worried the rich would save way too much money and not spend enough, which would lead to a glut of unsold stuff. His crazy solution? You needed a whole class of unproductive consumers, like landlords, to just buy up all the excess. You can almost hear the echoes of modern debates about stimulus versus austerity, right?
And nowhere do you see this clash more clearly than in the big fight over the Corn Laws, which were basically tariffs on imported grain. This was the 19th century version of every free trade versus protectionism argument we have today. Ricardo's take was simple. Get rid of them. Let cheap foreign grain in. Cheaper food meant capitalists could pay workers lower wages, which would boost profits and fuel economic growth. Malthus, on the other hand, he says, no, keep the laws. Protecting British farmers keeps food prices high, which means big profits for landlords. And they needed that money for all that unproductive consumption he thought was so important.
But, and this is incredible, out of this very specific kind of dry debate about grain tariffs, Ricardo develops one of the most powerful, most counterintuitive, and most important ideas in the entire history of economics, the theory of comparative advantage. It absolutely revolutionized how we think about global trade.
So how do we wrap our heads around this? Imagine you're on a family camping trip, and your dad is just amazing. He's better than anyone else at everything, pitching the tent, catching fish, collecting firewood. So should everyone else just sit back and watch him do all the work? Of course not. It's way more efficient if your dad focuses on the thing he's most best at, let's say fishing, while you go and do the task you're least bad at, like collecting firewood. The whole family ends up with more fish and more firewood. Everyone is better off. And that's comparative advantage. It proves that trade makes everyone richer, even if one country is better at making everything.
So for more than a decade, they go back and forth on recessions, on corn laws, on the very nature of value itself. And get this, they never actually agreed on a single thing. But maybe who won the argument isn't the point.
You see, their disagreements weren't just about economics. They were about two completely different ways of seeing the world. Ricardo was the hammer. He was a theorist who built these precise logical models and basically said, this is how it has to work. Malthus was the anvil. He was an observer who would just look at the messy real world and say, yeah, I hear your theory, but I just don't see it out there. One economist put it perfectly. It was like they were forging their ideas on each other. Each one served as the anvil for the other's hammer.
And through all of it, the arguments, the disagreements, the friendship never broke. Nothing shows this more than Ricardo's very last letter to Malthus, written just 2 weeks before he died. He basically says, look, we've argued forever, and we still think we're right, but none of that ever mattered for our friendship. And then he ends with, I could not like you more.
And when Ricardo passed away, it was a completely heartbroken Malthus who said, I never loved anybody out of my own family so much. Their story really leaves us with a powerful question, doesn't it? They chased after truth relentlessly, they disagreed about almost everything, but they valued their honesty and their friendship more than being right. In a world that feels so divided today, maybe that's their most important legacy of all.